to say that I decided to leave university, it was more like I was just so severely disillusioned that I just couldn't do it anymore. It's not as though I could have decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and continue. So anyway, I totally needed to back away, uh, you know, try to understand, find a new direction. It's disillusionment is the right term. It made me question everything. Um, Basically threw me back to a state that was in many ways reminiscent of what precipitated my leaving home when I was 15. So I probably could no more have continued with, even if I'd withdrawn from just from seminary, I couldn't have successfully completed my courses. So yeah. So what happened? A new vista opened up for me, um, in terms of psychoactive drugs. This was 1960, 1967 predominantly. Um, I I don't know how familiar people are now with what happened in the 60s, but
Well, just before the Summer of Love, isn't it?
it
Yeah.
was just before the Summer of Love. As a matter of fact, I was a part of all of that. Before the end of the second semester, I actually packed up and drove to California and went to Los Angeles. Well, taking the interstate, you end up in Los Angeles first and then head north to San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, uh, countless LSD trips along the way. Even before I left on this odyssey, I'd been introduced to a variety of psychedelics. Uh, I'd gone gathering peyote mushrooms in West Texas and began to, with other people of similar interests, experimenting with that. Psilocybin mushrooms, well, purified mescaline, in addition to the peyote cactus, which, just as an aside, is different. Even though mescaline is a primary active ingredient in peyote, there's a mixture of alkaloids. It produces a significantly different overall effect in peyote than with just purified mescaline. I was exploring all of these things, and I felt like through these psychedelic or psychoactive or entheogenic, I mean, my favorite term was entheogenic, because that was how I experienced these. The effects of these is they were opening the doors of perception to exactly the kind of vistas that I could relate to as having something to do with the mystical pursuits that I had been engaged in. And seemed to show some promise of understanding. Remember at this time, um, Timothy Leary, um, Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, these were uh, these people were highly respected and saying incredible things about the potential of this. We as young people went out and tried these things, and we discovered that, gee, this really does seem to be this wonderful way into a whole new universe of understanding. Uh, in my experience, psychedelics did uh, it just illustrated so completely in a profound experiential way what I had already discovered is the illusoriness of the world we lived in and the perceptions that we had. So, yeah. So I this was I was ready for something new. I was desperate. Everywhere I had looked, I'd come up dry. And now here was something that offered something immediately, tangibly promising of the direction that I wanted to go. And so, yeah, I immersed myself completely in it. I did go to San Francisco. I participated in the whole thing. Love-ins in the park. Even when I went back to Houston, large numbers of people would spontaneously gather, and half of them would be tripping on something or other. And in those environments, I came to be a trip doctor. I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
I think that you better explain that for the benefit. I'm sort of familiar, but I think it would be good to talk a little bit about that.
Well, people who had ingested psychoactive substances would not infrequently have experiences that were so shocking to them that they would have a bad trip. And it was sort of this kind of spontaneously self-reinforcing thing, sort of like somebody who's had panic attacks. If they believe they might be having a panic attack, it'll trigger one, right? If somebody believes they're having a bad trip, it'll trigger a bad trip. And I was especially good at just talking people into, hey, don't fight it. Just accept it. Everything's going to be all right.
So you sort of had a natural way with helping people through these really difficult experiences, which can seem sort of quite spiritually threatening, right?
Yeah.
As I understand it.
Well, I had some real life counterparts to bad trips. So, and I was sort of already prepared in advance
Right.
to deal with the tricks the mind can play.
Interesting. And so this seemed to offer you a lot. However, and I'm going to be a little bit challenging here, and that is to say to you, but if I were next to you back in 1968 or 69, I'd be saying to you, okay, this is all good, and you're having all these experiences, but I don't, know of any examples such as Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross or any of these people that were doing this by taking mushrooms. So had you at that point just given up on the idea that were those now fairy tales to you, and this was the only way you felt that science had the only answer here, science and chemicals?
No, not at all. Quite the opposite. Now, to put this in a proper context, at this point, I knew absolutely nothing about Eastern philosophies, religions, mystical practices, anything else. Meditation. That's something that evolved naturally as a next step from this. To me, to all of us, this was some wonderful new discovery. And then what was also coming to light at the same time, from today's perspective, it might be challenging to put oneself in the mind frame of 1960s. Most of us only learned as a part of that experience that the use of psychoactive substance is something that had a tremendous history going back a very long ways. When I was using peyote, it was sort of like, wow, here's something that is similar in many ways to LSD, and it can produce similar things. But here, it's not made in a laboratory. It's not something that was discovered by accident a decade or so ago in a laboratory. This is something that's in a plant, and all you have to do is go and find a plant and prepare it appropriately. It came later, the recognition, well, what we discovered is we were encroaching on Native American church territories and basically stealing their peyote. Anyway, I don't want to get off topic there. But no, this appeared to be a novel way of reaching the kinds of things that John of the Cross and Avila and the unknown author of The Cloud of Unknowing and people like that were talking about. And none of us really had the larger frame of reference to know that all of these things, similar things that have been explored in other cultures and other parts of the world for a long time. Like I say, that grew out of this from our fascination with psychoactive substances per se and the experiences that they gave rise to. Now, whereas many of the people I was with, it was just, oh wow, this is new, this is great, makes me feel good. I feel like I understand myself and things so much better, and all of
But
this.
you were still had a purpose here. You were still looking for this. This was not just about having a good time and, you know, having orgies in the park, sort of sort of thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, this is what was the predominant thing, but not entirely. There were a lot of people like myself too. Actually, my first encounter with psychedelics was it was when I was uh, working at the University of Texas Medical Branch before I got into university, and somehow or another, I came in contact. There was somebody, professor from University of Tennessee, uh, and he had been following very closely the work of Tim Leary and other people at Harvard. He was a professor of psychology, which is why he was aware of all that and following it. And one of the things that he told us about this, and he proposed that we go and we scour all of the local stores for morning glory seeds, heavenly blue and pearly gates. Now these have an analog of LSD in a relatively high concentration in these seeds. And so we bought as much of these seeds as we could, uh, ground them up in a coffee grinder, prepared them in ways that and we did a couple of uh, trips, so to speak, using the morning glory seeds. And that, so this would have been several years earlier. But I did have this previous experience and it had touched something in me, but ingesting ground morning glory seeds is an ordeal in itself. A reaction to it is severe gastrointestinal reaction. It's painful cramps involving vomiting. And it's only after you've gone through that part of the ordeal that you begin to have the experience of the psychoactive substance. And for whatever reason, I didn't do further research on morning glory seeds ever, but the experiences that I had touched on something, but were nothing nearly as powerful as what I later experienced with LSD and things like that. So I did have some previous experience with that, previous acquaintance, which had kind of been stored away in the back of my mind, but came to the surface when this whole new counterculture of psychedelic drugs and the whole psychedelic revolution took place. So this fit in a way that I'd already touched upon. So it was I'd had a previous inkling, and now all of a sudden, this seemed like it might be the answer that I wasn't finding in my previous pursuits. Well, the outcome of this, I remember I started out counting my LSD experiences, and somewhere somewhere in California on the beach, I hit 33, and then for one reason or another, I never knew how many times altogether in that period. Uh, but I never bothered to count the times I'd used other things. The only reason I mentioned that I actually counted 33 LSD trips is when I say I got into this in a big way, I got into this in a big way, right? Including discovering things like you couldn't use it you couldn't use it twice too close temporal proximity, or it wasn't going to work as well, and sometimes the consequences could be very problematic. what I learned from this, it's a deep exploration. I went into this seriously. I wasn't dabbling. I wanted to plumb the depths. And the conclusion I came to was one that quite a few of us in those days came to. Those of us who saw this as part of a spiritual journey was to realize its limitations. It was unpredictable. There was no framework to interpret these experiences. Um, it's like you're just grasping at things that were just beyond the limits of the ability to make sense of. Uh, it was like it's opening doorways to mysteries, but with no way to step across the threshold and truly enter into the other side. Well, other than very temporarily, and then it was gone. And actually, that made a really strong, that one lesson is something that's carried over throughout all my meditation practices, spiritual practices in general, is experiences that come and go. So, right, frankly, I say experience doesn't mean shit. It's whether or not those experiences produce a real permanent transformation. That's the only thing that counts. And that was the problem with psychedelics. They didn't provide a clear path to complete lasting transformation, merely glimpses, isolated experiences. It's true, you could use something like this, particularly the plant medicines, and go on an extended journey of several days. But still, whether it was 6 hours or whether it was 4 days, it was just it was just a slight excursion, right?
And you're left with no permanent knowledge and transformation. Um,
Well, some bits and pieces of permanent knowledge, but no
yeah.
framework to
But
put them
it's
together.
almost sounds like you're describing a dream that you wake up from, and then you struggle, you remember little bits of it here and there, but you can't remember the whole experience, and it and it's touched you, but in a way that you can't really quantify or capture again.
Well, the main thing is it's in a way that you can build on.
Yeah,
You don't have a way to go forward with it. Just like you'll have another dream some other night, you might take a psychoactive substance on another occasion, but that dream on another night and that experience on another occasion, it's its own thing. It's not, there's no continuity between it and what's gone before. Well, that's probably not true, but there's no easily discernible continuity that you can build on.
so um, I do want to, for the benefit, this is going to be on YouTube, and I think it's important to give a disclaimer here. We are not suggesting that people go out and use illicit substances, or that this is a. I mean, I think you're already saying it, but this is not this is not in the context of what you're describing. We're not talking about in Native American traditions or whatever, but this is not uh, a path that you think actually leads anywhere as far as true spiritual uh, growth and awakening in the long term.
Yes, I tried it. I tried it as thoroughly as I think anybody ever has.
Mhm.
And after I satisfied myself that it was not the answer,
Yeah,
and that's the important thing to get across, I learned from it. But one of the most important things I learned, well, two things. One is that somehow there is a way. This
yeah.
was, this was, you know,
It's real. It's
this was
touching
very,
something real.
but that's all it was, is a glimpse.
Is a glimpse.
That's all it could ever provide.
Yeah,
Uh, I mean, you could learn and grow to a certain degree, but a lifetime of playing with psychedelics. Later, I saw what it did to Timothy Leary. I saw what
yeah,
it did to Terence McKenna. I saw what it did to these other people who continued on with it.
yeah,
And I chose not to.
yeah.
I
A-
realized the limitations of it.
And is am I right in thinking that what you're saying is I tried, I went all the way so that you don't have to.
Right.
There are more fruitful ways for you to explore.
That's right. There.
Yeah,
Let me just add something to this. I'll jump
yeah,
ahead several decades where I went back to this, but I went back to in the context of shamanism, which I also trained in, and with the traditional uses of these plant medicines in context. Uh, Peyote and the mushroom veladas and the San Pedro Mesa ceremonies and all of these sorts of things. Ayahuasca ceremonies with trained ayahuasqueros. Uh, all of these things are enormously powerful. Those many years later, I discovered how over hundreds and thousands of years, people had learned to use these psychoactive substances in a way that truly was a path of spiritual development. So I went back and re-explored that years later in that context. But at that time, in the naive use that we had at that time, the knowledge, what I recognized most clearly was what it pointed towards and the fact that it couldn't deliver it in itself, right? So I was not the only one. There were quite a few of us.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And most of us were pretty much ignorant of anything Eastern other than chop suey, which actually is not even Chinese. But
So, I mean, I know this is a slightly delicate question, but I think it bears asking. Because meditation is such a long, if you're following samatha vipassana, and that sort of, it's a long training that requires a lot of dedication and resolve, let's say, usually for most people to bear fruit. So for a lot of people, especially us Westerners, we're often looking for the easy way, the quick way, and the simple way, particularly to something as alluring as enlightenment. So from your perspective, would you say that these other traditions, the ayahuasca, all this sort of thing, the Native American traditions, all of that, do they lead to the same kind of depth of spiritual realization that that you say you've experienced with practicing the Buddhist path?
well, I believe they do, but not very often. They take a long, long time and they have the potential to reach the same places.
Yeah.
But it's not a fast and efficient path.
Right. Okay.
Okay? It's less efficient and less rapid. I'm speaking now from the perspective 50 years later.
Yeah.
That what I've discovered is that these Eastern paths are very rapid and they're very effective. It's the form that they've come to us in. And I can say the same thing about ayahuasca ceremonies that are being conducted all over the United States now. And the Native American church is really, they've really clamped down on people, wanting to get involved and experiment and things like that. But for a while there, a lot of people, what the effect was is that it's diluted the power of those things. Mm-hmm. Same thing is true of all of these Eastern mystical traditions. They had already lost a lot of their vital essence over centuries. And when they were imported into the US, they were basically drained of their life juice and became these very narrow, shallow things that, yes, would seem like they would take an eternity, if ever, 10,000 lifetimes or something of practice to achieve anything. This was the wonderful thing about the 1960s and Western ignorance, because when we discovered these Eastern disciplines and their fruits, we discovered by virtue of the people that had realized these things. We didn't know about the centuries of lay practitioners who superficial practice, which all it ever gave them was a hope that they would be reincarnated as a monk. We didn't really know of all of generations and generations of monks in monasteries who had never achieved these glorious fruits that the practice promised. We just knew about the ones that had written about it. And in my case, this was all brand new. Uh, Other people of my generation were in a position to be able to go to the East, go to Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, wherever, and sample these things up close. And they're the ones that imported a lot of this back into the States. And then, of course, after the Chinese invasion of Tibet and the Tibetan diaspora, a lot of this stuff also began to come into the West. But that happened a lot later than that.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't know. Perhaps it might have been more daunting to some of us explorers, not myself, because I'd already been on this journey for quite a few years, and been up some blind alleys and things like that. So I didn't expect anything to happen magically overnight.
Yeah, yeah.
But I didn't have access to, I mean, there just wasn't the availability. Like right now, there's so much information available, not just on the internet, but even before the internet, so much became available in print.
Yeah.
The only sources that I could locate were the Vivekananda Vedanta Society in Chicago. And I purchased just about everything that they had available to read about this. Now, in regard to these being disciplines that take so very, very long to master, when Vivekananda went to that great spiritual religious fair in Chicago in the 1890s, he was only 30 years old. He was only a few years older than I was.
Mm-hmm.
And he had realized the fruits. And for me, that time frame, hey, that is no problem.
That's no problem, right? So
That's no problem at all.
just before we leave the topic of psychedelics, because I mean there has been an enormous I'm not sure it ever really went away, but there's much more of a resurgence of interest in Western people on trying to achieve awakening and or grand spiritual paths with psychedelics. Could you perhaps just take us through, and then we'll get back to jump back into your life. Take us through or describe to us, some of the risks involved and what it can offer and what it can't. I think you've covered that to some degree already. But just, as someone who's in psychology, I do see people experiment with this stuff and sometimes it does not turn out well. So I think it's worthwhile to tell people, here be dragons, proceed with caution.
Well, casual experimenters are going to be no better off today than they were in the 60s. But what is happening today that inspires me is that there are serious people researching the potential of using these things. And they have rediscovered what Leary referred to as set and setting, which is really the whole dynamic that is at least as important as the psychoactive substance itself in these various traditional ceremonies we're using, right? Where you're actually being guided by somebody that's done this 1,000 times before and guided 1,000 other people through this experience before. They have a vast accumulation of personal experience, and that is built on top of everything that has been passed along to them by the people that trained them. So now we have modern researchers with a different foundation. We have whole new degrees of understanding, whole new disciplines. Cognitive psychology as such did not exist a few decades ago. Our understanding of the brain and the nervous system has undergone an explosive growth, an exponential growth. Many different branches of psychology and philosophy, for that matter, exploring the nature of consciousness, how the mind processes information, what the mind is. There are people bringing that kind of knowledge and understanding to psychedelic substances as something which is going to alter mental processes, and what can we learn from this, and is there practical utility in this? Now, this is where these traditional ceremonies have so much to offer. These ceremonies always serve the purpose of healing so many things: physical diseases, addictions, um, just uh, depression, psychological disorders of all kinds, even what we would, things we would find uh, defined in the DSM, you know. And so, yes, let's discover the potential of these as tools, and let's add them to much larger collection of tools that includes things like meditation, and includes things like all of these modern uh, approaches to philosophy and, you know,
Therapy and that sort of
bio,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, philosophy, psychology, the mind-body dynamic, all the explorations of what it means to be an embodied mind. Um, these are valuable tools, and not only that, they're tools that, in combination with psychoactive substances, have a powerfully synergistic effect. So I welcome this. Now, we were on that same path in the 60s without sufficient background and preparation. And what happened is we had this, we ended up having almost every weekend, there would be some kind of gathering in parks all over the country, hundreds of people taking large doses of psychoactive substances, emergency rooms being flooded by, tens or dozens of people that uh, were having what was understood at the time to be a psychotic break, which wasn't really, it was just a bad trip. That's another thing that happens too, by the way, in meditation, is somebody can have the equivalent of a bad trip in meditation. It can be treated as though it's something more than it is, which will actually turn it into something more than it is. And that's back to the toxic meme of the dark night.
Right. And that's, as you said earlier, sort of, if you think you're going to have a bad trip, or if you interpret something as being a psychotic break, you may become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But
That's exactly.
to be fair, some people do run into some serious trouble with some of these substances taken in the wrong way, in the wrong settings, and all that sort of thing.
Yes, there's not that many people that don't have some serious uh, psychological, psycho-emotional problems of one sort or another. And they can live their whole life and not even realize that. But when something comes along that acts as a powerful trigger, they can, the needle can swing all the way to the other side.
How likely is it that someone, because it is sort of the vogue now to jump on a plane and go to South America, or as you say, it's now even being done
Mm-hmm.
in the States. But let's talk about proper, like, ayahuascaros and people like that. You jump on a plane, you go down there, you go through a legitimate ceremony with someone who's highly trained, highly experienced. How likely is it that someone is going to come back from that and be awakened, and what we're talking about in the Buddhist sense of the word, very highly spiritually realized individual? How likely do you think that prospect is?
Uh, minuscule.
But there are a lot of people that go and do that, and they come back, and they really uh, they don't come back thinking that they haven't. They come back thinking that that actually has happened to them, and the rest of their lives then is based on that uh, belief that they cannot be unconvinced of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they spend their whole life rationalizing why they're still just as troubled and miserable as they were before. Now that they've had these wonderful ayahuasca experiences, and they're supposedly awakened, enlightened. They've conflated a healing process in South America with a spiritual development process from other parts, other cultures in the world.
Yeah.
And now they're trying to make it come true. Well, how is that different than people who meditate in such a way and follow such practices that are going to produce oh wow experiences? And then on the basis of those oh wow experiences, they're told that, well, you're now a stream enterer. You're now in Arhat. And they're no more a stream enter in Arhat than anybody else.
Mm.
They just had some powerful experiences and the idea has been planted in their mind. Then they try to live it as a reality. And I watch these people, and it becomes more and more a tangled process of trying to bend something into being something it's not.
Right. I appreciate you speaking about this, but the one thing that I did also take away from what you've said here is that there are states and there are traits, as you've talked about
Yeah.
before, right? So there are amazing states that one can have with, whether it's taking psychoactive substances or whether it's with meditation or other spiritual practices. But what one is looking for is ultimately a permanent transformation, a permanent growth, right?
Right.
Okay, fantastic. So after trip number 33 of LSD, unless there was something else that you wanted to add about, do you feel we've covered it, or was there something else you wanted to add on the subject?
No, really, the main thing is that it. I recovered my hope, the validity of my aspiration was made valid once again. Uh, but I realized that, and I'll always be thankful for that experience, for providing that, and for the fact that I was not in this alone, and there were other people, and it opened up this whole, whole new world. There are all kinds of Eastern mystical traditions where the kind of thing that I didn't know existed had been around for thousands of years and had many, many different forms and variations available to it. And so that was the next direction that my personal spiritual quest took, was now to look at those Eastern philosophies and those Eastern practices. And in the very first baby steps in that direction, it was, like I say, it was hard to find anything. So I started out trying to teach myself using the writings of Vivekananda,
Can I
trying to.
just ask, how did you become aware of the fact that they were, other? Because up until this stage, it sounds like you were only really aware of, first of all, the Christian spiritual mystics, and then perhaps the Native American, the medicine-based sort of mysticism. And how did you then transition from that into finding Vivekananda and those sorts of things?
Well, like I say, it was being part of a community, and that community included, not just people that were playing around with something exciting and different, but people who were intelligent and much more thoughtful and serious about this, who recognized the same potential that I did, maybe coming from different backgrounds and for different reasons and in a different way. But I had a commonality with them. And of course, these are the people that I talked to. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I'd meet somebody that had been doing this, doing these different substances, and we'd compare notes. Have you tried this? Have you tried that? How did you find that? And what have you learned from this? And all those sorts of things. Well, that ongoing conversation over a period of only a few months, I guess this entire process of discovery from, uh, the first time I ate those morning glory seeds, that would have been 1963, and then we were talking about 1967. Oh, so much had happened in those 3 years, and so much had been learned. Well, when we reached this huge culmination, which was really 1967, 68 in terms of, well, at least what I could tell from my perspective, that, we reached this peak of a huge number of people, and a lot of them, university students, intelligent people, thoughtful people, people who had much more serious aspirations beyond just having a good time. We were talking about this, and they acquainted me. People who had resources that I didn't, or even knew things that existed, and so therefore were willing to look for them. I didn't know they existed, so I never looked for them, right? And they told me about it, and I got excited. I mean, I remember being told very enthusiastically, excitedly by a couple of people, oh, you've never heard of this, you've never heard of that. Well, let me tell you about this. And it's like, oh my God. this was even more eye-opening than taking LSD. And so that was the direction that my interest took. Now, this was another major crisis point in my life. I basically allowed my hard-won spot in society as a university student, as someone with a future in my life, to have fallen away. Remember, I really had no resources other than my training and being able to be a highly valued and difficult to come by commodity in terms of my skills with electron microscopes and preparing specimens and everything like that. So that was really the only thing I had. And of course, my background and other things. I'm not going to go into this in depth, but in the process of this, all of these psychoactive substances were illicit. And so to become immersed in it the way I did was to put oneself in contact with the whole world of illicit drug traffic. Mm-hmm. I had these backgrounds. I let myself get drawn into that. I made possible the things that I did by being a distributor of marijuana. And I ended up trying to stay away from, but inevitably being in contact with the same people that were dealing marijuana were dealing heroin and all kinds of other things. Yeah. Right. And one of the worst things that happened to me was I had taken possession of a large quantity of marijuana to distribute, and it had been stolen from me. And the person I got it from was, he was mafiosi. Yeah. And
not a good position to be in.
I was in a classic, very, very difficult position. I won't go into the details, but I ended up being arrested, charged. It was kind of a setup. Fortunately for me, another series of miraculous events occurred. I mean, I could go into this in detail, and it's an incredible story. It really is.
That sounds worth it, Culadasa. I mean, unless you feel that it really is not going to add anything to the tale.
Well, I was at the point where it's time to get on with my life again. I've discovered a new direction. I'm not going to find the answers today or tomorrow. What am I going to do? All of a sudden, bam, I'm in trouble. Several things happen. Bam, bam, bam. I find myself arrested and charged with possession of various drugs. As I say, it was a complex situation. There was, within the mafia families at that time, a huge contentious issue was drugs. Some dons were totally against anything to do with drugs. Others said this is the thing of the future. A friend of mine, another young man he was very mafia, he had dabbled in drugs, and his family, his father, had pulled him out of that, warned him to never do that again because our family does not do drugs. We do not sell drugs. He started doing it again. And I was the person that was distributing his drugs. I was the person who, had lost a large consignment. So he was in a great deal of difficulty because if his father and the family that he was a part of discovered that he'd gotten involved in drugs again, the consequences to him and to the family would be very great. Something an individual does in that society overflows to everyone else. And there's only one way to prevent that overflow, which I would imagine you recognize what it is. The person who deviates, they're either eliminated or else everyone shares the.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he was in a huge crisis. I was in a mess. I was in jail. And well, let me just tell you the story. I was in jail. They took me into the county jail. And the first thing that happened there, it's a huge block, all these 6-man cells around the perimeter and an open area in the middle. And there was one, and the inmates, one particular group of inmates that they had also adopted for themselves the name the family. And these were people, you know, it was the family would always change because people would be arrested, they'd spend weeks or months, days, weeks or months, whatever, in the county facility. They'd go to trial, they'd eventually go to prisons, things like that. But there was always this nucleus that ran the county jail facilities from the inside. And that was who, you know, anybody new comes in, you get interviewed by the family, they decide, so they want to know what I was charged with. They assigned me the, you know, I was in the junkie tank. So I was with 7 other guys in a place with designed for 6 bunks, but also had 2 extra mattresses on the floor because they didn't have enough space. And most of these other men in the cell were uh, in severe withdrawal from heroin and things like that. I managed to get on the outs with the family during my stay there. I was put in a very, very difficult position. I don't know if I should even disclose it. I will. Okay. There was somebody who came in who had been, he had Down syndrome. He was pretty severely mentally impaired. He had been charged with molesting a minor relative of his. And based on those charges, and based on their antagonism towards me, before they locked the doors to the group cells that night, I was informed that I was to execute this child molester, and if I didn't, then I would be executed the next day. Well, there was no way that I could do that. I was awake all night. I didn't know what to do. There was nothing I could do. I couldn't do what they asked, and I couldn't not do it. So I didn't know what. And then they did something that is, they call it pull chain. And when they pull chain, it means they call out those selected inmates who are going to be transferred to a different facility. And usually they pulled chain after breakfast in the morning. But it was before 6 a.m. This only time, in my experience and to my knowledge, it was very unusual to pull chain before the doors were opened in the morning. Like I say, it was usually after breakfast. But they came in and pulled chain and they called out my name. I was extracted.
Oh my word.
Yeah. Like the noose was already around my neck and
Wow.
I was led away from the gallows. And so I was transferred to a county work farm, a very different environment. And that's where I was approaching time for my trial. But during this period, the person that I had been involved with pulled a bunch of strings. And well, what happened is, as it was a meeting with the lawyer that with the lawyer that had been assigned to me, and a couple of lawyers from the family of the person I dealt with, and the deal that they had made was that they would get all the charges against me dropped, but I had to leave Texas and never ever return on penalty of yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, I ended up a year later. I was invited to go to Canada as part of a team that had been assembled to put together a new cardiac research facility in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I was in charge of setting up the electron microscope lab there. I was actually employed at medical school in St. Louis, and became liked and favored by a number of people there. And one of those people was somebody who was just finishing his postdoc, had a glorious career ahead of him. He was very promising. He had received what in those days was a huge grant to come to Canada and set up this cardiac research laboratory, including an electron microscope facility, which in those days was pretty rare.
Yeah.
And he tapped me to come as a part of his team on a 2-year contract to set up that electron microscope facility. And well, I didn't stay 2 years, I stayed 28. And in that time, I went from being a member of the team, lab technician basically was my title, to, I completed my undergraduate degrees, a degree in Winnipeg, University of Winnipeg. Then I became a graduate student. Well, actually, yes, yeah, I became a graduate student at the University of Manitoba Medical School, which involved some string pulling once again. But as a matter of fact, they offered me a place in incoming medical class first, and I said I don't want to be a doctor, you know. So instead, I became a graduate student, did a master's degree, Ph.D., and everything after that. So I got my life back together, but I also had this new direction that I was working with in parallel. Coming out of the psychedelic experience, having newly tapped into and begun trying to practice meditation and learning more about Eastern disciplines. Well, it was not too long after I arrived at the University of Manitoba Medical School, physiology.
Sorry, Culadasa, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but you did start off at one point, and then I interrupted you, where you had spoken about you had started looking at Vivekananda. So can we perhaps just talk a little bit how your progress into that, and what you learned, and the limitations, because I know you've talked a little bit about this before.
Well, I loved everything that I was learning, that I was reading in these different books. In terms of practice, what I focused on was Vivekananda's translation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Yoga Sutras. Sorry, I'm slipping into the Pali, and I should be in a Sanskrit. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And even today, there's hundreds of translations of that, but Patanjali's, I think, is still, well, it may have been because it was my first experience, and I just worked and reworked every word and phrase and sentence in there, trying to understand what it was, and using it as a guide to meditate. And anybody that's familiar with the Yoga Sutras will realize basically what a futile endeavor that is to self-teach using that as your manual. But I nevertheless, because I tried so hard I mean, I approached this exactly the same way as I became a seminarian, and I got up every morning in time to do the Stations of the Cross. So I started sitting and trying to understand what it is that the words of Vivekananda translated, what it is that they were pointing towards. And I learned a lot in a kind of trial and error way. And I can't say that I ever really succeeded in meditating in the intention, in the way it was intended and the way it was being talked about. But it was still a vast treasure of experiential learning to try.
Was this at the same time as was this before you came to Canada that you had started this?
Yes, I
Yeah.
started it in Houston, I continued it in St. Louis, and I continued it in Winnipeg. This was what I was about to get to. Was a few months after I arrived in Winnipeg, one of the wife of one of the faculty members had become very involved in the Transcendental Meditation movement, which I hadn't even heard of until then. But I had been talking to people who were interested in the things that I was doing. And so she heard about that and she came to me and said, "Would you be interested in?" And yes, I would. And so then I had, for the first time in my life, some real instruction in a form of meditation. And this was an incredible experience for me. And I was so taken by it that I wanted to get into it very deeply. How do you get into it more deeply? Well, I don't know how it is today, it's probably similar, but at that time, well, you go through the initiation, you practice, you go back regularly, you learn more. There's a progression you can follow. One of the first things that you do is you become a meditation checker. So for somebody that comes into it, when you're learning to meditate, after your initiation, you go back and the meditation checker, you meditate with them, and then they talk to you about it. So I became a meditation checker, and then I wanted to become a meditation teacher. So I started on that path. Before I got very far on that, though, I encountered my first Buddhist teacher, uh, Kemananda. And, well, I'll tell you how this came about. My wife was cooking in one of the first natural foods restaurants in North America, certainly one of the first in the Canadian prairies. And one night, someone came in uh, who played subahar, which is like a large version of a sitar. And when he performed some beautiful music with an instrument that I had never seen before. I'd always loved music, and I'd learned to play a number of musical instruments in my life already. My interest in musical instruments had caused me about 6 months earlier to purchase a smashed sitar from a fellow graduate student. Um, uh, this graduate student was East Indian. He went back to India to marry, and one of his wife's wedding presents was a beautiful sitar. I have that sitar today. The main gourd on it got smashed on the airplane. Mm. And he sold it to me for $25. I had no idea what I was going to do with it. It was just a fascinating instrument, and I fantasied that someday I would put it together and learn to play it. Typically unrealistic, typical me. And so it sat, all the pieces in a bag, for months. Then I saw this man playing a larger version of the same instrument on stage in front of me. Even more than that was fascinating is that um, when he took a break, there were a number of people in the restaurant who got up and went with him. And he went outside, and what were they doing? So I kind of got up and went outside to see what they were doing. I mean, I was just hanging out in the restaurant because my wife was cooking in there at the time. My wife of the time was cooking there. So I kind of followed them out, and what they were doing is they were chanting together, and they all had these strings of beads that as they chanted together, that they were passing through their fingers. And I was like, wow, what is this all about? And I was fascinated. Anyway, before he left that night, I approached Kema and I said, by the way, I have this sitar that's broken. Do you think you could help me repair it? And so he gave me an address. He said, come and see me. Uh, it's funny the things you can remember after all this. Come and see me Thursday afternoon at this address and bring your sitar with you. Over the ensuing weeks, and this was once a week and then it became twice a week, we gradually reassembled, gluing together these pieces, using a tuning fork to tell whether the joint was good or not, and if it wasn't good, then we'd have to rework it. Kema had very high standards of workmanship that he held himself to, which I benefited greatly from this. So we would sit and we would work on piecing together like a jigsaw puzzle and gluing in place all of these fractured pieces of the main gourd on the sitar, eventually redoing all of the woodwork, everything else, to turn it into a serviceable instrument. And all the while, he would talk to me about Buddhism. And I was fascinated by everything that he said. I remember the one thing that he said that made the most profound impression on me is he said about the Buddha's teaching, he said, the Buddha said, don't take my word for any of this. Come and see for yourself. Now, that is the scientific approach, right? That is also the most rational approach. I was very disenchanted with taking anything on faith from anyone, anywhere. Been there, done that. Well, I wasn't going to make that mistake again. And to be presented with the most systematic and coherent doctrine of spiritual development that I'd ever heard of in my life, and to be told, don't take my word for any of this, just try it, see for yourself, then I felt like, yeah, I was home.
Yeah. I mean, that is just, perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but the kismet of having that broken sitar and then meeting this person, and when so much of that you speak in TMI, you speak about the whole unification of mind, basically putting your mind together into a serviceable instrument, right? I mean, it's, from a psychoanalytical point of view, we'd go, that's pretty amazing. And then that is, I'm not sure which instrument it was, but in the suttas where the Buddha does the famous discourse on the strings not being too taut or too, was it a sitar or something similar?
It was an instrument similar to a sitar. I don't think it was a sitar. I think it may have been one of the predecessors to. It was a stringed instrument, though.
Stringed instrument, yeah.
And the thing about many Indian instruments is that they usually have sympathetic strings, which must be tuned to each other and to the main strings in a way that produces that they vibrate sympathetically. I mean, they can be strummed, and they are in certain parts of the music, but most of the time they're not touched, but they have to be tuned just right so they resonate with the notes that you're plucking on the main string. And this gives it this incredible richness.
Yes.
Sound. Yes. And so you need to know that about musical instruments in order not to mistake it like tuning a guitar or like tuning a modern Western lute, which is a guitar-like instrument. We're not just talking about tuning the strings in a good enough way to produce a recognizable melody. We're talking about tuning a lot of strings in such a way that they're in perfect resonance with each other.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, just in telling you this, I realized that learning to play sitar, learning to tune a sitar, discovering the incredible potential that there is in finding that exact resonance. The experience of thinking you found it and, oh, isn't this lovely? And then somebody else coming along and helping you a little bit later and discovering, oh, there's a whole new dimension of sound that because I hadn't quite gotten all of these strings, each individual string not too loose and not too tight, you know, that had a profound that was a profound formative experience in itself. It helped me to understand a lot of things since. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's that's what that reference is about.
Yeah. What year are we talking about here, more or less?
We'd be talking about, I guess, 1970.
1970. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's also about the same time that Ravi Shankar was introduced to the West, and there was this influx of Eastern culture. All that. Yeah.
I discovered Ravi Shankar, and I bought, I think, the first album that he produced, in a vinyl album
Yeah.
in the U.S.
Amazing. Yeah. So there was this interaction between the time, the zeitgeist, and your experiences that were just perfectly aligned to push you in this direction. So I think that we've run out of time for today. Before I let you go, though, can I just ask you? You did say that you had learned to play other musical instruments. Were you self-taught, and which instruments are we talking about?
Well, what I had learned to play, the only experience I had in school that was of any meaning or value to me, since I was horrible at everything else and couldn't, was extremely uncomfortable with the classroom. The only thing that really appealed to me was band. And so the first musical instrument I learned was clarinet. And as a matter of fact, the only thing I would go to school for were the band lessons. And of course, I got my own clarinet, and so I could play at home. So even though I only made it to maybe 2 or 3 band classes in a week at most, uh, and I loved it. And my mother was very musical. My father was very musical. They both played piano. My mother sang. I was very familiar with music. I loved it, and it was one of the positive aspects of my family life was music. I mean, uh, with all of the other things I've said about my father, he would also come home and from work and release his tensions by playing the piano, just playing gorgeous piano music. And so, anyway, I started out with the clarinet, then I was introduced to the saxophone, then the oboe. And I loved the oboe. I was taught to make my own reeds, and I played the oboe. So I was mostly involved with wind instruments. In in my early university years, I was introduced to guitar, and I had a really cheap, crappy plastic guitar that that I'd gotten hold of for free. And so I'd self-taught myself a little bit on the guitar, but I never, probably largely due to the quality of the instrument, I would never. Well, also the fact that between working 20 hours a week and carrying a very full-time load at university, there wasn't time.
There wasn't time.
But that was my first stringed instrument, and my second stringed instrument was this sitar that I got on a whim. And by the way, back in 1969, 1970, $25 for a graduate student was a hell of a
Was
lot
a
of
lot
money.
of money. And I
Yeah,
presume that, your average music shop did not have a lot of sitars lying around either.
none,
Yeah.
absolutely none.
So you really found it kind of a gem in a sense.
That's true. Yes, I did. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. All right, so I think next time we will begin with Kemananda and your experiences with him mending the sitar and getting involved with Buddhist teachings through him. This has been really fascinating. I think the thing that always strikes me is that the amazing swings that your life went through. You know, it wasn't, there was no you were certainly not walking a middle way in terms of your life. It was, you know, really amazing heights that you were reaching, and then swinging completely to the other end, which I think was pretty amazing, and then back again.
Well, I averaged the middle way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you that. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and we will continue next week.